Hi ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good evening to you all. As we all know, I'm sure, the Arab Spring has taken a drastic turn in the past 2 years with the emergence of what is known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. There's been quite an interesting reaction from Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and it is with this in mind that the MSA and Middle East North Africa Society have convened the following panel to discuss issues surrounding the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and also questions about Islam in general. Talk 1 will be delivered by Abdullah Andalusi, who is a prominent Muslim debater, media personality and senior researcher with the Muslim Debate Initiative. And talk 2 surrounding the current reality will be delivered by Muhammad Dilwar Hussain, who is a prominent Muslim journalist, deputy editor of 5 Pillars and frequent contributor to the Huffington Post. Each speaker will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes each, and will follow with an in-depth Q&A. Can I please remind the audience to keep questions around the topic, please, and not to interrupt the speaker while they do respond. I do recognise that this is a very heated and emotionally charged topic, but I do request the audience keep their emotions at bay, and anyone who does get a little bit leery, you will be asked to leave by security at both entrances. So I'll just call up Abdullah Andalusi to speak regarding the origins. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to thank you students of SOAS for attending, externals and journalists and media representatives who will be misquoting me after this talk. Now, ISIS, it was seemingly unknown amongst the greater world until its declaration of caliphate, and it took Mosul last year in June, late June. And history never begins with just a sudden event. There are precursors, there is a context to their rise, and it's quite surprising that obviously there are some misconceptions out there. Now, in order to investigate any phenomenon, you have to investigate it objectively. Just because people do bad things, and there are some very bad groups and bad organizations, doesn't mean that they just spontaneously arose out of nowhere, and there wasn't any other actors involved, other people involved, other countries and states involved, which didn't affect or cause, or perhaps even do worse things which led to their rise. And we want to really investigate that. Now, I'm going to start with a bit of a history lesson in the Algerian Civil War. We know that at the beginning of the 90s, the Algerian government, Algeria had elections. And in the elections, the FIS party, it was Islamic party, was going to win by a landslide, taking the majority of the votes. How did the Algerian government react? They annulled the elections, the military stepped in, and this was supported by France, UK, America, with the excuse saying that sometimes you must be undemocratic to protect democracy. Now, predictably, what happened was that with all the avenues blocked for the Islamic political groups, and they were being banned, their members were being arrested, there were a proportion of them resorted to insurgency and violence against the Algerian government. And the Algerian government was deeply hated in Algerian society because they had just annulled popular elections. Now, out of this milieu of rebel groups which were arising and which were now fighting against the Algerian government, many of these groups were popular amongst the Algerians. There arose a group known as the GIA now, and this group initially, was one of the many of the rebel groups fighting against the Algerian government. But then something changed with the GIA. They a faction of them began to declare themselves a caliph and a caliphate. They had taken a few towns. They declared themselves a caliphate, and they said that any other Islamic group that doesn't recognize their caliphate or their preeminence are apostates and are rebels and must be fought. And then this expanded to if the people, the Algerian people, don't recognize their caliphate, then they too are apostates and must be fought and are rebels. And this is despite the majority of the Islamic groups obviously being shocked and surprised by this. But what happened, the effect which happened was that the population, which was sympathetic to the rebel groups, and the rebel groups themselves being attacked by GIA, having their leaders assassinated and having attacks on civilians, predictably the rebel groups either they disassociated themselves from GIA, a lot of them disbanded, a lot of them accepted the government amnesty, and most of the people resorted back to loyalty to the government. It then turned out later that this faction of the GIA had been infiltrated or working with Algerian intelligence agencies. This came out through a few defectors, and it also came out that the British government actually knew of this, that the Algerian government had been complicit and actually directing attacks against their own civilians with fighters that appeared to be Islamically attired. And this brought disrepute onto the Islamic cause and subverted the entire insurgency or rebellion and the civil war against the Algerian government. Now, a lot of the actions we see in that is very familiar. Where have we heard this before? Where have we seen this before? And there's a lot of parallels, but I'll get to that a bit later. Now, a history lesson on Iraq. Again, Iraq didn't begin in July 2014. It had a long history, but I'd like to go back to the time when it was under the Ottoman Caliphate. It consisted of 3 administrative zones: the Wilaya of Mosul, the Wilaya of Baghdad, and the Wilaya of Basra. Wilaya, you could say, is like a county or district in Arabic, is the Arabic word for it. And during World War I, the Ottoman Caliphate was fighting the British, and the British decided to attack the Ottomans and break the power of the Ottoman Empire and then divide it into pieces. Now, Sir Mark Sykes, British MP, in 1915, he discussed the objective of what Britain will do towards the Ottoman Empire and why. And he said this. He said, in order to reduce the malignant power of political pan-Islam, to defeat the enemy, it is essential to destroy the Ottoman Empire. He also said in 1917 that I want to see a permanent Anglo-French entente allied to the Jews, Arabs and Armenians, which will render pan-Islamism innocuous and protect India and Africa from the Turco-German combine. Just a little bit of detail about that. Germany had allied itself with the Ottomans, and Germany was actually strangely advocating jihad, global jihad, through many of the British colonies and getting the Muslims to try to rise up against the British colonialists. It was actually quite strange, a European power supporting and advocating global jihad using the Ottomans in that capacity. It was part of their chess game against Britain, but of course, in order to destroy that, the Ottoman Empire was to be destroyed, and for the express purposes of getting rid of pan-Islamism or pan-Islam. I mean, where have we heard that before? Now, what happened after the Ottomans were disestablished was that a protectorate was set up in Iraq by an American puppet, Hussein, and as J.E. Shukbar said in his 1919 missive to the Foreign Office in Tehran, he said, it is officially agreed that we must go through the official pantomime known as declaring a protectorate, but it is not clear that this disability need limit to any appreciable extent the practical control we can exercise over Mesopotamian affairs. So basically, the Iraqi state was a puppet state, a facade of a protectorate. The Iraqi oil was exploited, and its foreign and internal affairs were firmly under control of Britain, but they used the figurehead of a puppet to give the natives the impression that Iraq was under their own control. Now, there were some rebellions against British control, and Britain put them down by aerial bombardment of towns and cities, as the infamous Arthur Harris, known later as Bomber Harris for his destruction of Dresden in World War II. He said, "The Arab and the Kurd now know what real bombing means in casualties and damage. Within 45 minutes, a full-sized village can be practically wiped out and a third of its inhabitants killed or injured." And he was talking about how effective British bombing was to reduce and destroy the morale of rebels who were rebelling against British control of Iraq. And we also see in World War II, Iraq again was invaded again by Britain militarily when it had a coup and wanted to defect out of British control. So Iraq has had a bit of a long history with foreign control, with insurgency, and unfortunately with aerial bombardment. But I'd like to kind of fast forward it until when the US kind of took interest in Iraq. We see that with the US initially supported the Ba'athist coup, which came to power and overthrew the regime of General Qasim, and initially it was supported by the CIA. But later on, when Saddam Hussein took control of the Ba'athist party and tried to implement an Iraq which was under Arab nationalism, independent, strong, and tried to dominate the other Arab countries in the region, which threatened US interests, the US changed its policy towards Iraq. We see that Iran and Iraq, there were many intelligence sources and politicians now, and historians will affirm that the Iran-Iraq war was incited by the USA, and weapons were supplied to both sides to fight each other and thereby reduce collectively the power of these two states. Including in what was supplied to Saddam Hussein was the tools used to make biological and chemical weapons. He deployed them. He deployed them not only against Kurds, also against some Iranian border towns. Iran sued for peace when Saddam Hussein, which was under pressure from Iran in the war they were losing, threatened to bomb Tehran with chemical weapons. And Iran, seeing that the world doesn't really care about Iranian casualties, just tried to sue for peace. We see that, and again, that wasn't brought up in terms of any sanctions against Iraq at the time, because Iraq was discharging certain policies which America wanted to see happen, which was the reduction of the power of Iran. Now, interestingly enough, just a funny little quirk of history, we hear that Iran and Israel are not the best of friends today, but Iran has a lot to thank Israel, because during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, Israel helped supply weapons to Iran to fight against Iraq. It's quite funny, but it's actually true. Now, fast forwarding, we see that there is good evidence to suggest that in the wake of the Iran-Iraq war, when Iraq was suffering crippling debts, Kuwait was incited by the US to reduce oil prices and damage the economy of Iraq and the rebuilding of Iraq, prompting Iraq to go to war with Kuwait. Saddam Hussein asked permission infamously from April Gillespie, and she said she didn't care about internal Arab affairs, but then she did care about internal Arab affairs after the invasion of Kuwait. Now, when Kuwait was liberated of Iraqi presence, there was a number of sanctions and a number of military operations imposed against Iraq, including sanctions on medicine and food, which caused close to 500,000 young children to die from the effects of that. Now, fast forwarding it to the most recent invasion of Iraq, which would probably be the fourth or fifth invasion it's received in the last 100 years from the West. We see that the pretext of chemical weapons and biological weapons in Iraq, rendering Iraq somehow a dangerous country, was used for its invasion, but no one really cared when Iraq was deploying these weapons against Iran or against Kurds. In fact, the USA actually blocked any attempt to put sanctions on Iraq during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, while it was using chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. But after the invasion of Iraq, we see that the US moved to set up an Iraqi interim government. Again, I'm not going to bother you too much with the details of the process of how it controlled the structure of the government. It had a massive influence in determining the nature of the constitution, including putting in clauses which effectively would render Iraq 3 semi-autonomous areas. Some political analysts have said that this could possibly be to weaken Iraq, any future Iraqi state, from ever being a powerful unitary state, from being a divided state into 3 parts. Many people have also observed that the Iraqi policy towards the US policy towards the Iraqis was also sectarian. They would treat the Iraqi Shias differently, the Kurds differently, and the Iraqi Sunnis differently, and it exacerbated and caused a sectarian divide, which wasn't as pronounced as it was before. In fact, when people want to portray the Saddam regime as being a sectarian regime, they forget the point that the Iraqi army was 3/4 Shia. The top generals and members of the Ba'athist party were Shia, and the Saddam's only concern as a secular dictator was the rise of religious fundamentalism amongst Shias, which would be exported from Iran. That was his only concern. A typical Arab secular dictator ruler being concerned about religious fundamentalism, but he didn't care about the sectarian divide. He was a typical authoritarian ruler, so he did very nasty things to his people, suppressed obviously free expression, arrested political dissidents. But this is no different to every other Arab dictator and authoritarian ruler supported by the US and the UK. Now, there was, and I know people also say that the war was perpetrated for Iraqi oil. I don't want to entertain too much that because I want to keep it on subject, but I have to give you as much context as possible. Well, all I would like you maybe to research is a very kind of lesser well-known issue of the Iraqi Hydrocarbon Law. I suggest you research that. Many of you maybe who've studied that know about it already. From the get-go, there was huge US pressure on this nascent Iraqi government to pass the Iraqi Hydrocarbon Law, which will allow foreign corporations to buy the rights to the development of fields which are currently undeveloped and are extremely lucrative. This current issue is still ongoing, and there is a lot of pressure on the Iraqi government. The higher tier were willing to oblige. Unfortunately, all the elected representatives of the Iraqi people, there was a rightful concern of a conspiracy of America to use that Iraqi Hydrocarbon Law to basically sell off the assets of Iraq and control them. So there was a lot of resistance from that, and there's been a current sticking point, and I'll get back to that in a bit. Now, predictably, of course, with every invasion of any country, there was an insurgency that arose from it, and that insurgency was actually mixed. Although mostly the Kurdish regions were certainly autonomous, and America certainly respected that for the most part. There was an insurgency from the Shia sources and Sunni sources from within Iraq. Now, the de-Baathification process and the firing of the Iraqi army was considered to be one of the primary, you could say, radicalizing factors which put a trained group of people who were trained in military means into the insurgency and were able to fight against the American regime and launch insurgent attacks. But also, but that's not just the only explanation. In general speaking, it is just natural, and we see this as naturally observant from any invasion, that there will be an insurgency arise. What that did was, and what America, the strategy behind de-Baathification was a typical American practice, which they learned from World War II, certainly how they dealt with Japan and how they dealt with post-World War II Germany, was that you could facilitate a regime change, and to do so you have to eliminate all the previous political structure that was there before, the intelligentsia, the people who were believed in a particular sectarian or political idea. You get rid of them and you replace them with a brand new set of people that you can decide who they are, and you can put them into power. Of course, it didn't work very well in Iraq's case. And what this led to happening was people who knew the lay of the land in Iraq, who, especially former Ba'athist intelligence agencies, which were able to fundraise, make weapons, and deploy against the US Army. Now I can begin, I suppose, with Al-Qaeda. Now I've set the scene for Iraq in this very brief and condensed history lecture. Al-Qaeda, people misunderstand the structure of Al-Qaeda generally. Al-Qaeda isn't some massive, rigidly hierarchical organization. It's impossible for it to be a rigidly hierarchical organization because the US intelligence services and military and security operations throughout many different countries would arrest the leaders and would dismantle the network. So the model that Al-Qaeda usually runs by is to set up semi-autonomous groups, or perhaps even fully autonomous groups, as a franchise in different areas with a nominal allegiance of the leader of this particular regional group to the head of Al-Qaeda. Now, there was an organization in Iraq and Jordan prior to the Iraq War, which was called Jamaat al-Tawheed wal Jihad, which was roughly started in 1999 and disbanded in 2004. It was changed, and it was led by Zarqawi, the infamous Zarqawi, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He then changed this organization to Tanzim Qa'idat al-Jihad fi al-Bilad al-Rafidain, a double-barreled name, but basically it means the base of jihad in the land of the two rivers. I'll just call it TJ for now, because it's a bit of a double-barreled name. So he set up this organization, and he pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, and in some ways it was actually called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was nicknamed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that's pretty much what it was. It was the Al-Qaeda franchise in Iraq. Now, from 2004 to 2006, it was part of a larger insurgency against the American forces, but it soon distinguished itself from the wider insurgency in a number of ways. Zarqawi, he went against apparently Osama bin Laden's orders, and which was he started to target Shias, so Iraqi Shias. He started to target any Iraqi Sunni group which disagreed with him, certain leaders and so on and so forth. And he started to alienate a lot of the groups. He started to do bombing attacks against Shias in civilian areas, configured for mass casualties. And Ayman Zawahiri sent him a rather strong-worded letter telling him to stop attacking Shias and to stop killing civilians. You know how it's quite interesting. Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden disapproving of the killing of Shias and telling people to stop killing Shias. That's not the narrative generally that we hear, but that's actually absolutely true. And they were saying it was counterproductive. It didn't make any sense. Why are you doing this? It's going to undermine the entire insurgency against the Americans. Why not just focus on the Americans? Don't focus on the Shias. And there are many amongst the Shias who were also fighting against the Americans. Now, Al-Qaeda's general ideology was that it was initially fighting against the Muslim regimes who were viewed as puppet leaders and puppet rulers. But then it had an idea to expand its jihad, its declaration of jihad, to the puppet master, so to speak, what it considered to be the puppet master behind these puppet rulers, which was the US and certain Western powers, but primarily it was the US. And in that, they justified a methodology which is un-Islamic and is completely modern, and that is this idea of total war against civilians, war against the entire nation. And Osama bin Laden, he was asked by an interviewer from Al Jazeera, how do you justify this? In Islam, it forbids killing of women and children. So how do you justify this? And he said something very fascinating. He goes, yes, it's true. The Prophet Muhammad forbade the killing of women and children, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, that law's not set in stone. That's what he said. Osama bin Laden is a modernist. He's a reformist, or whatever you want to call it. He's basically very modern. And he cited as an example the US. He said when the US bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they didn't care about civilians. And when basically the UK bombed Germany bombed citizens, civilians, they didn't care about innocence. So he cites as his model not an interpretation of Islamic text, not some argument from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. He cites as his model the West. He's copying the West. He wants to be the mirror image of the Western methodology of war. Obviously, from Islamic jurisprudence, you can't. We're not modernist. We don't believe in reforming Islam. The whole point of why Islam should not be reformed is because it lets very crazy things like this happen. If you say we don't need to follow the rules of war or the rules which are set in stone, I personally believe, and obviously most Muslims believe, thank God, that the law is set in stone, and you can't change that law, because we believe that by following God's commandments, God will give us success and victory in this life and the next. And you shouldn't break those commands just because it's a modern concern or it's just the modern fashion of doing warfare. But anyway, that's a side issue. But just an interesting point about the ideology of Al Qaeda is actually modern and actually Western, not actually based on an Islamic concept or jurisprudence. Now, in 2006, after the death of Zarqawi, the group which was known as Al Qaeda in Iraq, or TJ, they formed together with a few other groups the Mujahideen Shura Council, and that lasted a few months until it was changed to the Islamic State in Iraq with the blessings of Zawahiri, and it was led by Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He was the predecessor. Now, it's a very interesting thing about how Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi came to power. A very interesting story. He was arrested and detained in Camp Bucca in Iraq under the US control. And there was some very interesting statements we have from people who were with him about how he was treated by the Americans. They actually gave him quite a lot of respect. He was viewed as someone that would sort out problems between the prison inmates. Apparently, according to some reports, the Americans let him visit other prisons for some strange reason. Why would they do that? I don't understand. And he would network, and he would gather about him a coterie of individuals. After he was released, he set up a group called Jaysh al-Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat, and it only lasted 1 week. And then, on the pretext of being the leader of this group, he was allowed to join the Mujahideen Shura Council as one of the the council members. That's a meteoric rise to power, an unsubstantiated rise to power. How is it his group is only set for 1 week, and he joins this Mujahideen Shura Council, and they immediately put him onto the highest tier of that council. But that's just an interesting point. So then we see the Islamic State in Iraq under Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and in 2006. Then, as the result of the Islamic State of Iraq's strategy, which was that it declared itself an Islamic State, any one of the group who didn't recognize them as being an Islamic State were apostates, rebels that need to be fought. They focused on attacking Shia, and they basically alienated the insurgency that was against the Americans, and they caused the Sunnis to face a lot of the backlash from the Shia-dominated Iraqi government. Then we see what we call the Sahwa, the awakening councils that arise. The people the Sunni civilians are armed, like in what happened in Algeria. Very similarly, the civilians were armed in forming these protective, patriotic groups or civilian protection units. And Al Qaeda become crippled. They actually report that in 2008 they were in a state of crisis, and they didn't know, they didn't know they were on the back foot. Then we see that in 2009 they had changed their composition. Mostly they had been non-Iraqis in Al Qaeda. Some people say that because they were non-Iraqis, they lacked the tact of dealing with the people that lived in Iraq and didn't know how to relate to Iraqis, and would ride roughshod over the cultural and social structures that were in Iraq. But in 2009 they had changed their structure or their membership, and they consisted of majority Iraqis. Now, how did they get to that point? It was widely perceived that the oppression of Iraqi Sunnis after the Iraqi government was populated with basically a lot of sectarian claims of sectarian Shia politicians. And the oppression, the raids on people's houses, the detaining, torture, killing. I think it's been understated just how pretty nasty the Iraqi government was to the Iraqi people during this time. We're not just talking about just arresting people and putting them into jails. We're talking about torture with power drills, beatings, summary executions. People would be, cigarette butts would be extinguished on them. We'd see that they'd be their bodies would be found gagged and shot through the head and dumped on the streets. And actually, it's still happening, unfortunately, within Iraq. And so, under this pressure, a lot of the Iraqi Sunnis then started to fill up the ranks of this Islamic State in Iraq. Then in May 2010, Abu Omar al-Baghdadi is reported to be killed, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi takes over power. Now, this is a bit of a summary of obviously how he came to power and what happened. But again, they didn't control any towns and cities. Islamic State in Iraq didn't. They were everywhere in all the Sunni areas. They were in Mosul. In 2008, we hear a report that the U.S. Army and the Iraqi government were clearing out Al Qaeda from Mosul. Pretty much, they've been in most of the towns and cities they are in now. They've always been there, actually. It's just that now they can operate more openly. But before, they've always been infiltrated into Samarra, into Tikrit, into Fallujah. They've always actually been there. Now, what happened between 2010 to 2014 that saw their rise to power? Well, as the US were leaving Iraq because they couldn't agree a states of forces agreement, the Iraqis weren't going to renew it, so they had to leave. But they left some forces there. They made another agreement which allows them to basically give military assistance to Iraq at any time and have access to their military bases. But they couldn't leave thousands of troops as some of the US politicians wanted. However, there were 5,000 military contractors which were left in Iraq after the withdrawal. I liked how they call it military contractors. It's just a euphemism for mercenaries, basically. But anyway. So then, what happened was, after the US Army had withdrawn from Iraq, we saw a rise in bombings and attacks and kidnappings and killings by the Islamic State of Iraq. This was their time to expand now. The US Army were gone. They were facing an inexperienced and ill-equipped Iraqi army, and for them, their main strategy was this. They would disable the Iraqi government so much so they could begin to take over towns and places. Now, why did they call themselves the Islamic State? And there was a reason. Apparently, it was actually Zawahiri's brainchild. And what he thought was that as the Iraqi government destabilizes and areas of Iraq fall out of government security, they would use their name to establish a parallel state which would then take over these areas and provide security and infrastructure to the Iraqi people, and thereby ultimately overturn the Iraqi regime which was installed by the US and put their regime which is Iraqi and of a claimed Islamic character. But there was something else that happened which Zawahiri and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi didn't see happen, and what most people didn't see happen was you had the Arab Spring and you had Syria fall to the Arab Spring. And what happened in Syria was that, long story short, there were defections from the Syrian army. People equipped themselves and they started to fight an insurgency and a warfare against the Syrian government. Now, the Syrian government was on the back foot for a lot of for the initial stages. Certainly in 2012, you saw the rise of various Islamic groups. One of them was Jabhat al-Nusra, which apparently it was set up by a person known as Jolani, who was affiliated somewhat with Islamic State of Iraq. He was a Syrian that had fought in Iraq against the Americans. He was released, according to one report, he was released from a Syrian jail as the civil war started to begin in Syria, a lot of people have said, and a lot of reports have said, that Bashar al-Assad, who was concerned about revolution, did what many of the authoritarian regimes have done. Certainly, what Mubarak did, or certainly what he said, and certainly what Gaddafi said, which is, if the West or the people do not support me, then an Islamic regime will come into power, and that's what you don't want. Better you stick with the secular devil you know than the Islamic regime that you don't, and won't be so compliant with US foreign policy or Western foreign policy. And some people say that he cynically released a lot of Islamic individuals from the jails in order to suffuse the insurgency against him with an Islamic character, and then claim that they were terrorists and they were going to set up a Sharia state, and thereby get support from the West back on his side and sympathy back on his side. But the problem was that these Islamic groups initially were actually very popular with the Syrian people. Now, while the West dithered on supplying weapons to the rebels, very much because of the worry that they don't want to see a Sharia state there, they prefer a secular state than a Sharia state. While his plan worked when it came to the West, when it came to the Syrian people, it didn't work. The Syrian people actually started to support a lot of these groups. Now, Jabhat al-Nusra, towards the end of 2012, after it started to grow in prominence in in Syria, and was very popular, was declared by the US to be a terrorist organization. Now, they hadn't declared themselves Al-Qaeda at this point, and at this point in time, they were just another one of the many Islamic opposition groups. Many people questioned, including Turkey and many other countries, that why are you doing this? This is counterproductive. If you really want to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, this is counterproductive to start declaring some of the rebel groups to be terrorist groups. Some people have said, well, some of their tactics involve bombing and killing pro-regime journalists or pro-regime politicians or civil service members, but the FSA were doing exactly the same thing. There are reports that show that the FSA were targeting pro-Assad journalists, pro-Assad civil service members, pro-Assad individuals and spokesmen, just the same. So why is it that the FSA haven't been made terrorists, but Jabhat al-Nusra have been made terrorists? Why this double standard when it comes to it? Now, I mean, one other argument they've said is that Jabhat al-Nusra, the members have had dealings with Al-Qaeda in the past, so that makes them Al-Qaeda. But the problem with this argument is that then you'd also have to say that the Syrian fighters, Syrian Kurdish fighters, are also terrorists, because they certainly have had dealings and are having dealings with the PKK, who are also a prescribed terrorist organization. So the arguments, the justifications didn't really make sense, and were very selective by the US. But something interesting happened in early 2013. Bashar al-Assad withdrew a lot of his army from eastern Syria and bolstered his western flanks, and also withdrew some of his army from southern Syria and brought them more central. Raqqa was almost virtually surrendered or uncontested almost to the Islamic groups. Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as many other Islamic groups, took over Raqqa. But the interesting thing is this: at the same time as Bashar al-Assad withdrawing his army from eastern Syria, we see Islamic State of Iraq sending Iraqi fighters into Syria, a lot of them under the pretext they were joining Jabhat al-Nusra, and they were taking over the second line areas, the rear areas. Jabhat al-Nusra put its Syrian members and forces to the west flank to fight where the regime was, and just like that, we hear that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi institutes a coup from within Jabhat al-Nusra of all the Iraqi new volunteers into Jabhat al-Nusra, and a lot of the Iraqi infiltrators all suddenly declare allegiance to the Islamic State of Iraq, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi then declares it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And this took apparently Jabhat al-Nusra by surprise, and they said that they were unaware that this declaration of a merger was happening between the two, because Baghdadi said it was a merger was happening, and he said that, oh yes, Jabhat al-Nusra, they're part of Al-Qaeda, I sent them over to Syria, and we're now having a formal merger, and the Jolani denied it, and was apparently shocked by this, said, I have no knowledge of this. Then with the rear areas of Jabhat al-Nusra being taken over by ISIS, unexpectedly, Jabhat al-Nusra then appeared and then made an allegiance to, they declared their allegiance to Osama bin Laden, and tried to get Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, and tried to get Ayman Zawahiri and Al-Qaeda to intervene and to condemn ISIS and tell them to go back and stay back in Iraq. Now the thing is this, ISIS or ISI prior to this had been nominally given allegiance. It was giving its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. It had nominally given its allegiance to Al-Qaeda, and people have said that Jolani had reaffirmed his allegiance to Al-Qaeda in early 2013, but this is not actually true. It was actually the first time he declared his allegiance. He actually openly said, he declares allegiance right now to Al-Qaeda. So prior he wasn't Al-Qaeda, but then he put his allegiance to Al-Qaeda, and what he did was he tried to get Al-Qaeda to intervene and to mediate in order to force the Iraqi group back into Iraq. That didn't work. Al-Bakr Baghdadi said, I reject the sayings of a man over commands of God. Basically, he was saying that unity is better than division, so he will now take control of Syria, and that was basically what happened. This is how he took over the eastern parts of Syria. He didn't conquer Raqqa. He never actually conquered. He didn't. ISIS never actually came in and conquered Raqqa. It was actually by an internal coup, and it was actually quite shocking that this would happen. But even more strangely is that Bashar al-Assad's army refused, or is not refused, but just didn't attack ISIS. And what's more, we hear reports of them doing oil deals and trade with ISIS, supplying them with weapons, supplying them supplying with resources, money, and oil, and in exchange for oil. And instead, Bashar al-Assad would focus his army only on the other Syrian groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra and Islamic Front and Ahrar al-Sham and on many of the other Islamic groups. He'd focus on them, and he would leave ISIS. And ISIS would focus on only attacking the Syrian rebel groups. Now, as I said, I'm not one for conspiracy theories, because I try to base observations on evidence. But WikiLeaks reported in, I think it was 2008, the Syrian intelligence approaching the US, saying that they had infiltrated many of the Iraqi insurgents, which is while the insurgency in Iraq was going on. They'd infiltrated Iraqi insurgents, and in exchange for some kind of, obviously, a negotiation with Syria, the Syrian intelligence could report and surrender to the US the Iraqi insurgents, at the US request. So the Syrian intelligence services had infiltrated. Had a long history of infiltrating the Iraqi insurgency and directing them, or having some agreements with them, and on working side by side. And indeed, Syria was a patron of the Iraqi insurgency and the Iraqi groups. So, is it too far-fetched that maybe Bashar al-Assad tried the Algerian option to undermine the rebellion against him? Possibly. Maybe if the future will tell us more of this. Okay, so then now 2013 occurred, the beginning of infighting between the rebel groups in Syria, and what we see is that Jabhat al-Nusra and many of the other Islamic groups start fighting against ISIS, and they take back Raqqa in January, and then ISIS takes it back from them after a few weeks. But something very fascinating happened in January 2014. Mosul wasn't the first time when ISIS had actually taken over an entire city. They had taken over Fallujah in 2014, and areas of Samarra as well. at that time. But we didn't hear any big news story about this. Many U.S. journalists, they went and they lobbied Obama and said, look what's happening, Al Qaeda is back and they've taken over a town, and do something about this. We see that the president of Iraq, Nouri Maliki, beseeches Obama for weapons and to fight back. Because look, they've taken over a town or a small city, we have to go and take it back. And again, we hear no response from Obama, no response from the US. Instead, what was reiterated then was deal with your sectarian issues and pass the Iraqi Hydrocarbon Law, then we talk. That's what we hear. And it happened throughout spring of 2014, a desperate Iraqi government, and again with the same response from the US government. Of course, in Iraq, there isn't only ISIS. There is also many other renewed Sunni insurgency groups, which were upset at, of course, and they had grievances at how they were being treated by the Iraqi government, how Sunnis were being treated by the very sectarian and very nasty government and their policies. Many Sunni politicians had to leave Iraq because they were basically accused of supporting insurgency and then sentenced to execution, and they had to leave Iraq. Like I think Tariq Hashemi had to do, former vice president. So the Iraqi government wasn't a nice, friendly, pluralistic government open to everyone. It had some very strong sectarian groups, and not all the groups were sectarian, and certainly there were many, and most of the Shia populace are not sectarian. It was the nature of the government was sectarian, though. So then, what we see then is we see former Ba'athists in Iraq, especially set up this movement called the Naqshbandi order. Naqshbandi is a Sufi Sufi tariqa, a Sufi kind of a group, and they set up this Sufi group which does jihad. If anyone knows the history about Sufis, there's many prominent Sufis throughout history who've done jihad. Sufis are not pacifists in the history of Islam. But anyway, this group, which were former Ba'athists, suddenly ally themselves with ISIS, and they help facilitate the takeover of Mosul. So the Naqshbandi army helped facilitate the takeover of Mosul. But there's something very interesting, though. You see, Mosul was garrisoned by 30,000 Iraqi army troops, and yet we saw a combined force, Naqshbandi and ISIS, and various others, of about 900, and just at their mere approach, they withdrew. Now, the ISIS propagandists like to say, it's because of our power of jihad, that's we won and we scared our enemies. Oh really, but you weren't attacking Kirkuk, yet somehow they all withdrew from Kirkuk as well. Yeah, all the Iraqi army withdrew from Kirkuk as well. There was no ISIS attack on Kirkuk. What caused 30,000 Iraqi army soldiers to suddenly withdraw from their posts and withdraw from Kirkuk, giving it to the Kurds, with no opposition at all against a small force of 900? Now, Nouri Maliki claimed there was a conspiracy against him, and some of the two leading generals which were meant to be in command of this have never been indicted. But the next level subordinate is currently being indicted in Iraq for deserting his post and cowardice and so on and so forth. And he claimed that he was actually left to dry by these two high level generals. But that's a different discussion. And again, I'm not into conspiracy theory. However, it's just extremely strange how that occurred. And then suddenly, with ISIS and Naqshbandi takeover of Mosul, bang, ISIS come onto the media spotlight, and they come into the global mindset of they exist. They're this powerful group who just suddenly swept to power. It wasn't sudden, it was known. Later US intelligence services, politicians will say, how were the intelligence services so blindsided to not seen them coming? They weren't. They had been reporting it to Obama since January 2014. But Obama and the top administration didn't seem to listen, didn't seem to do anything about it. Now, prior to the declaration of caliphate, the media, very strange. I noticed this is the first one I saw on Channel 4, a Channel 4 program, a news program, where they talked about the coming caliphate, or they talked about Sunni versus Shia, rise of the new caliphate. This was before ISIS had declared caliphate. Did Channel 4 or did Jon Snow know something that we didn't? Could he be a member of ISIS? We don't know. However, much of the Western media were talking about a caliphate before the declaration of caliphate. And if you think, but that's because we studied ISIS and we know that they've always wanted a caliphate, but they've been publicly declaring they wanted a caliphate since 2010. So, and they took over Fallujah, and there was no declaration of caliphate. Why would everyone saying this? And suddenly, with all this media hype about coming caliphate, ISIS, who've been very desperate to win people over to their side, then declare at the end of June 29th, a caliphate. Almost a self-fulfilling prophecy by the Western media. In fact, I would dare posit, and I will leave this to my colleague to take over, but I would dare posit that the biggest propaganda arm for ISIS have been the Western newspapers, Western TV channels, and media outlets. They have hyped ISIS. They have done so much service to ISIS to make them so much more bigger than what they have been before. They've taken towns before. No one said anything about it. They've been in everywhere they are now. They've been there for years, since 2008 even. Yeah, there was clearing operations of Mosul in 2008. No one says, "Oh look, they have a caliphate." No one says this. Yet they take over Mosul. And suddenly they become this big existential threat to the world. I leave that there, and I'll leave it to my colleague to take over to discuss the current issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Abdullah for that in-depth and informative critique of ISIS. Now just call Mohammed Zalwa Hussain, journalist, deputy editor of 5 Pillars, and regular contributor to the Huffington Post.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I want to begin by greeting you all with the best of greetings, the greetings of Islam, the greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As a journalist, I try to keep the subjects that I write about quite varied, quite diverse. And I happened to bump into Abdullah yesterday on the way to the train station. And we were saying, I feel a bit bogged down, we're constantly talking about ISIS, writing about ISIS, debating about ISIS. We've become ISIS experts overnight, didn't we? And it can get quite frustrating sometimes, because I want to write about other things, I want to talk about other things, but I find myself constantly writing or talking about ISIS. So principally as a journalist, I can't drop it. I have to keep on top of what's relevant, what's recent, and what's hot in the news. So, the reason why I asked Abdullah yesterday that, look, when you give your talk tomorrow, just end at the declaration of a caliphate. And there's an important reason why I've centered my talk around that date, the 29th, the 30th of June, which also happened to be the 1st of Ramadan. And the reason why I'm going to center my talk around this declaration is because that majority of Sunni Muslims, regardless of their theological or juristic differences, tend to agree that a caliphate, or the concept of a caliphate, is at the heart and the center point of the religion, whether they differ in its re-establishment. So my talk is going to center around 3 elements: the reaction of the Muslim world and Muslim groups to the declaration of a caliphate, the response of Western governments to the declaration of a caliphate, and lastly, how the Western media has responded to this call. Now, many of you may be wondering, well, you're here to give a talk about the reality of ISIS. We're living here in the West, we're living here in the UK. So the reality I'm going to highlight towards the end of my talk affects us very much so. So let's start with the Muslim world's response and how the Syrian rebels responded to this call that was made, or this announcement of a caliphate. And so I'm going to touch upon Syria and Iraq first, because these are the 2 countries which the self-professed Islamic State has carved itself some land out. The rebels, a group which had formed called the Majlis al-Shura al-Mujahideen al-Sharqiyya, which was a wide group of alliance of numerous Islamist rebels, which included Jabhat al-Nusra. They rejected this claim of ISIS. The Association of Syrian Scholars, and Hayat al-Sham al-Islamiyya, which is also another council consisting of over 300 Syrian scholars and activists, rejected this claim. And in fact, ISIS, as Abdullah mentioned, became a thorn in the Syrian revolution. They became a source of disunity amongst the rebels. And in fact, in 2012, the Syrian rebels were knocking on the doors of Damascus, very close and imminent to victory. But ISIS had changed all that. And as Abdullah also mentioned, it's well documented from the Syrian regime and ISIS senior generals that they sell oil to the regime. And Assad also rarely attacks ISIS positions. Again, I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but this is the observations from on the ground. Moving on to Iraq. I feel the ISIS reality in Iraq is somewhat different to that of Syria. And the reason why that is because that's where the organization began. It began in Iraq. And it had previously been defeated by numerous Sunni tribes, the Sahawat Council. And so they had learnt their mistakes from the previous encounters with the Sunni population. And in fact, as a result of a sectarian, US-armed, Iranian-backed, Shia-led sectarian government, ISIS all of a sudden became a lesser of two evils. And that's quite a bold statement. But that should give you some idea of how brutal the Iraqi government must have been. And in fact, their crimes is significantly underreported in the media. ISIS is more successful in Iraq now because it's fighting a battle of hearts and minds. It's learnt its mistakes from the past. Many senior ISIS leaders are former Ba'athists of the Saddam regime, very well trained. And it was the US-led invasion, then the subsequent Shia-led government of Nouri al-Maliki which facilitated ISIS to come back into the arena. And just to touch upon the situation in Iraq, if we have any Iraqis in the audience, I'm sure they'll agree. Saddam was a brutal secular dictator. He killed as many Kurds as he did Shias, as he did Sunnis. He killed people and tribes and family members. This is well documented. He was just a brutal dictator. There was no such thing as sectarian violence in Iraq prior to the US-led invasion. Sectarianism between Shias and Sunnis and Kurds who predominantly are Sunnis anyway, all this began post US-led invasion. Moving on to Lebanon, a small country which has faced the brunt of what's happening in Syria. The two big Salafist organizations, Tawheed Islamic Movement and the Brotherhood Association, rejected ISIS's claim. Hizb ut-Tahrir, a global Islamic political party which has been working for the re-establishment of the Caliphate since 1953, also rejected this claim. The Muslim Brotherhood, the oldest, most veteran, the grandfather Islamist movement of the Muslim world, they too rejected this claim. Al-Azhar University, the most pristine, prominent academic institution in the Muslim world, rejected this claim. But I wouldn't take their rejection too seriously. After all, this was an institution which supported General Sisi when he massacred 2,000 Egyptians in Rabaa al-Adawiyah. The Saudi religious establishment, the hub, the heartland of the so-called Wahhabi ideology, they conveniently rejected this claim as well. So what you actually find is that Islamist groups or political Islamic parties or other jihadist factions have unanimously, categorically rejected this announcement of a caliphate. Not because they disbelieve the actual concept or the obligation to establish such a state, rather the conditions that were not met and find juristic differences which are very much valid. Now looking into some of the Muslim majority states, how did they respond? Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan felt threatened by ISIS and conveniently, without hesitation, joined the US-led airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Now, there seems to be a level of hypocrisy here and double standards. I mean, where was this hesitance when 200,000 Syrians were being killed for 4 years? Where was this help when Egyptians were massacred by General al-Sisi in Rabaa al-Adawiyah? Or when Israel massacred 1,200 Gazans, predominantly women and children, who were left limbless and headless? Saudi had absolutely no problem going into Bahrain to quell the Shia uprising there. So what we can see is there's a level of double standards here. But there's one country in particular which I focus on, and I always keep a tab on this country, because whilst I'm not a believer of conspiracy theories, Turkey is one that always raises interest. It is well documented, confirmed by Turkish officials, that they buy cheap oil from ISIS in the black markets. They allow fighters from the West to cross the borders. They treat ISIS fighters in their hospitals. Turkey is a NATO member, and it's a key US ally, and always has been. So one must raise the question, how does Turkey get away with doing all that? Being a NATO member, a key US ally, buying cheap oil, allowing fighters to cross the border, this is something that everyone should take a note of. If you ever want to follow or you hear conspiracy theories, always keep an eye on Turkey, because in fact Turkey as a nation, it has a very interesting relationship with ISIS. And just to note, before I move on to the Western states' response or reaction to this announcement, armed groups, generally speaking, when they rely on external funding or external weapons, are vulnerable to infiltration. This is well documented throughout the whole of history, not just ISIS or Al-Qaeda. We know very well that South American groups, armed groups, were infiltrated by the CIA, to name just a few, not just ISIS. Moving on to the West. In Europe, we've seen widespread anti-terror arrests in Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Holland, Germany and the UK. And it's not necessarily been because they've been a part of ISIS or they've returned to their countries after fighting for ISIS or actually even intending to go and fight with ISIS. In some cases, it was just a mere case of possessing a black flag with the Muslim declaration of faith, which has now been criminalized and become synonymous to ISIS. In other cases, it was just a case of having jihadi audio tapes, not even necessarily belonging to ISIS or an ISIS scholar. Similarly, in Australia, we've seen a wave of anti-terror raids and arrests. We had the very recent Lindler Cafe hostage situation, and all of this has facilitated to a legislation which will ban Quranic verses pertaining to jihad and governance because it's interpreted as propagation of terrorism. The US, the spearheader, the leader of the military campaign against ISIS, in reality, it was just a continuation of their Middle East foreign policy. In fact, as Abdullah explained, it was the US-led invasion which in fact facilitated and sparked the reality of ISIS to emerge as a group. And let's not forget, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, amongst other senior leaders, spent many years in a US prison called Camp Bukha, and they allowed ISIS to wreak havoc for many years until they approached Erbil. Erbil is the capital of the Kurdish north, and in Erbil there's 6 oil companies, American oil companies, and that is when the US airstrikes began. Not because Yazidis were pushed to the mountains, none of this humanitarian help. The first airstrikes began when ISIS approached Erbil, where there were 6 oil companies. So as you can see, the only reason why the airstrikes began was not for a humanitarian cause or for a greater good, it was to protect their self-economic interests. And let's take it back a few years. For those of you who followed the Iraq invasion under Bush, one of his exit strategies, which was published by CIA officials, was that when he realized that, look, you know what, perhaps Iraq can't be a beacon of democracy, clearly. What can we do? How can we leave Iraq as champions? And one of the plans Bush had was to split Iraq into 3 autonomous states, to a predominantly Sunni state in the center, a Shia-led state in the south, and an autonomous Kurdish north. Perhaps Obama, again, I'm not saying this as a conspiracy theory, we're just judging from what is apparent, maybe he allowed ISIS to wreak havoc to fulfill his predecessor's wishes. I come to our country, our homeland, where we were all born or reside, the UK. How has the UK responded to the whole ISIS saga? Home Secretary Theresa May announced in August that the terror threat level had increased from substantial to severe. But wait a minute, she went on to say, this means a terrorist attack is highly likely, although there is no intelligence to suggest that one is imminent. I mean, I wasn't the only one that was baffled when I read this. I mean, how do you judge or how do you measure when a terror threat level can be substantiated if there's no intelligence to suggest that one is imminent? Strange. ISIS is in fact being used to justify draconian policies. Muslim charities and activists linked to Syria have been either being shut down, targeted or arrested. Most notably Muazzam Beg, a former detainee of Guantanamo Bay. He was arrested and put in prison for 7 months for apparently being linked to terrorist organizations in Syria. He was released, the charges were dropped, but it just gives you an idea of what's actually going on in the UK. Harsh sentences are being passed under the banner of Syria-related terrorism. And what you'll actually find when you scratch beneath the surface, that these arrests and these punishments are being handed down not necessarily because of actual physical or tangible actions, it's rather on thoughts and intentions. The Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill very recently received its 3rd hearing. This bill, if it gets passed as legislation, which I strongly feel it will, this could be one of the most damaging pieces of legislation for the British Muslim community. It involves draconian Orwellian measures such as spying on toddlers as young as 3, 4 and 5 to report them to the authorities. If the government's counter-terrorism prevent strategy becomes statutory, this will allow Prevent to take children away from their parents if they deem the parents to be extreme or radical. Confiscating passports, revoking citizenship, reintroducing the Snoopers Charter. The government will be able to access your emails, your text messages and your social media accounts. Clearly this is a curtailment of the most basic of civil liberties for the sake of national security. I mean, what's happened to all those proud liberal democratic values that the West champions itself in? ISIS is in fact being used to push these policies through. And what they've actually done is that they've linked what's happening in Iraq to an alleged fear or threat of an attack that may take place in the UK. And there seems to be, again, a double standard here. The British fighters, mercenaries, former SAS soldiers, agents and former British soldiers are fighting alongside the PKK, a terrorist organisation under the EU and NATO. There was no issues with British Jews joining the IDF, British Kurds joining the PKK, some Shias leaving the UK to join the Shia militias. There was no issues with Muslims leaving to join the Libyan revolution to fight alongside the Libyan Islamists against the Gaddafi regime. And if you take it back a few more years, they had absolutely no problem with Muslims leaving the UK to fight the Afghan war against the Russians, or in Bosnia. Britain claims to care about its citizens, as does the US. But they refuse to pay ransom for James Foley, for Stephen Sotloff, for David Haynes, for Alan Henning, because apparently they don't negotiate with terrorists. But France, Italy, Germany and Turkey paid ransoms and their citizens were released safely. And on the point of not negotiating with terrorists, they had absolutely no problem releasing the Lockerbie bomber when they made negotiations with Gaddafi or when they contemplated dialogue with the Taliban. Now I've saved the most important till the last, and that's the role of the Western media. There seems to be a calculated strategy between the government's domestic security policies and its foreign policy and the way the media has pushed and facilitated these policies to be accepted, or at the very least kept silent amongst the general public. And there seems to be 2 elements to this media campaign in light of ISIS's claim to a caliphate. Firstly, to criminalize the concept of a caliphate. The concept of a caliphate, a mainstream, normative, orthodox concept within Sunni Islam, has been used as a yardstick because of what ISIS has done to basically hit the Muslims and keep them in line. To basically distance themselves from not ISIS per se, but to distance themselves from this concept of a caliphate. Secondly, the whole ISIS saga has been conveniently used to create a secular, liberal, European British version of Islam. I'm sure if many of you watched Monday's episode of Panorama, the fight for British Islam, you get an idea of what I'm saying. And I just want to mention 3 campaigns that were spearheaded by the British press. Firstly, the Not In My Name campaign went viral, hashtag Not In My Name. So whatever ISIS is doing, every Muslim had to hold up a card and saying, Not In My Name. Then there was the Sons United Against ISIS campaign, which was apparently for people of all faith and no faith. But again, on the front page, there was a woman donning a Union Jack hijab. But of course, it was only for it's for people of all faith and no faith. And then there was the whole poppy hijab campaign, which a religious garment was nationalized and used to basically forward a certain agenda to basically make Muslims prove their allegiance to the UK. And why should Muslims apologize? Why should Muslims apologize for what the actions of a militia is doing? Is every Catholic expected to apologize for the paedophilia ring at the heart of the Vatican? Is every white Briton expected to apologize for the crimes of Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris and 1 million dead Iraqis? Is every Buddhist expected to apologize for the crimes of the Burmese monks against Muslims? Is every Hindu expected to apologize for the crimes of the BJP party in India? It's absolutely disgraceful, and of course it should not be tolerated. Muslims, as a global population of 1.6 billion, should not be guilty by association of faith and made to apologize. There's been more than 5,000 articles on ISIS in the last 7 months in the British press, in print and online. I did a bit of maths yesterday, and that works out to be 25 articles a day for the last 7 months. 25 articles a day on ISIS, or a subject concerning ISIS, caliphate, or something along those lines. So on the one hand, the British media is asking British Muslims to apologise, to condemn, Not In My Name, and so forth. But on the other hand, it continues to refer to this militia as an Islamic state, and a strong one for that matter. And what it's actually doing is creating an environment and a narrative of fear and hate towards Muslims, which will at the end justify anti-terror laws, foreign policy and state expenditure on national security. To conclude, the Arab world is in a mess. It has been in a mess for the last 80 years. The Arab Spring, which began as a promising chapter for that region, was in fact became just a chapter of cosmetic changes. The faces of these regimes changed, but the regimes and the systems, the oppressive systems, remained in place. ISIS is fighting battles on every front, or at least it appears so. And to be honest, without Western airstrikes or not, I feel that in the coming years they will self-implode themselves. In the West, how is ISIS affected? The rise of Islamophobia in Europe has become mainstream. In Sweden, in a week alone, there was 4 attacks in a mosque. There's 20,000 right-wing racist protesters in the streets of Dresden under the name of the Pegida movement. In France, the Charlie Hebdo incident again brings into light the role of Muslims living in the West. Me and Abdullah, we attended a report launch a fortnight ago by a think tank called Claystone, and this report was entitled "A Decade Lost: Rethinking Radicalization and Extremism." It was authored by a gentleman called Professor Arun Kunnani. A wicked report, fantastic report. For those of you who are studying extremism or political ideologies or the war on terror, should take a note of this report. So basically, what he said in this report was that foreign policy is solely to blame for terrorism, not ideology or extreme or radical views. And what he actually said was that the neoconservative think tanks in the US and some even in UK who had advocated this theory have retracted and taken that back. And the reason why that is because as the war on terror developed, they realized that, you know what, extreme or radical views does not actually lead to violence. What actually leads to violence is the role of America and the UK amongst other Western states and what they are doing in the Muslim world. It's a case of tit for tat. You cause trouble in our lands, we will come and cause trouble in your lands. Explicitly as that. And I find that quite profound, because even now we are still hearing the whole conveyor belt theory, that all of a sudden having a politicized version of Islam or having extreme radical views will somehow eventually lead to terrorism. This is from a scholastic and academically perspective, is unsubstantiated. And I'm going to make a few bold statements. I don't blame ISIS for what's happening in the Middle East. I blame Western foreign policy. Because at the end of the day, it was the US-led invasion that created ISIS, or at least at the very least facilitated that environment. After 2 failed wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the best thing that could have ever happened to the UK and the US is ISIS. What better way to justify the last 13 or 14 years of military escapades in that region by the creation of ISIS? To quote General Richard Dannett, the head of the British Armed Forces, he said a few years back, "We are here in Afghanistan to prevent an 8th century caliphate." And there you have it. You've got your 8th century caliphate. All for that 13 years that you were fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, all that bloodshed, all that money, taxpayers' money, has now we've got it. We've got ISIS now. We've got that caliphate that we want to fight and portray as the bogeyman. And I'm going to conclude by saying that ISIS was basically the West's doctor's sick note to continue its foreign policy in the Muslim world.